everyone. So, thanks for joining today's webinar, Play Bigger. My name is Christina Nanfeld. I work on Onsite's Marketing Center of Excellence here at Insight, and I'm really excited to introduce our speaker, Dave Peterson of Play Bigger Advisors. Dave is a co-author of a book, Play Bigger, a far-sighted and pioneering guide that incorporates data analysis, interviews, and research to reveal the inner workings of category kings. Insight's hope is that by the end of this webinar, you'll be exposed to new ways of living, thinking, or doing business, often solving problems we didn't even know we had. So before I pass the mic to Dave, please note that you can share your questions in the control panel, and we'll be answering them at the end. We'll also be recording this webinar and sharing the materials on our blog before the end of the day, so stay tuned for an email from me, Christina. And with that, I'll leave it to Dave. Thanks, Dave.
All right, thank you, Christina, and thanks everybody for joining us today. And I'm very happy to be partnered up here with Insight and share what we have learned about this whole concept of category design. And hopefully we'll be speaking for about 35 minutes about some of the high-level topics around category design. And more importantly, it would be great if we could leave you a couple of takeaways to take back to your day jobs and apply immediately. And so we'll try to stick the landing and make this thing very real so you can walk away with a couple of actionable insights. And then obviously, if there's any question, we've heard them all. So please share. We even appreciate zingers if you have them. So go ahead and lay down those questions. And with all that said, why don't we get started? So, at the highest level, every product, service, and company that we love exists because some legendary entrepreneur solved an unsolvable problem and built a company, product, and category at the exact same time. And we didn't invent category design. It was something that we at Play Bigger that we focus on and help companies with. But there's category design's been happening throughout history. One of the favorite stories that we like to share is a story that we researched in our book around a guy named Clarence Birdseye. And Clarence was kind of an adventurous soul, and he was up in northern Canada observing local fishermen flash freeze fish. That's kind of hard to say 3 times in a row. And the insight he had is, these fishermen would literally catch a fish, freeze it right then and there on the ice, keep it frozen. And the reason they kept it frozen is because they wanted to keep it fresh. And then the day they would want fresh fish, they would just thaw it out, cook it, and they'd have, the fish would be as fresh as the day they caught it. And Clarence was a problem solver by nature. He was trying to figure out a problem on how to get fresh vegetables out to the masses. And this was back in the 1920s. And at that time in that era, the only way you got fresh vegetables is if you lived near a farm or a market. And certainly in the wintertime, you weren't going to be able to access them. So your only option came out of a can. And he was up there trying to observe how these people this technique they use for fish, would it apply to vegetables? And so turns out it worked. And he created a way to flash freeze vegetables. And then the story just began, because at that point in time, back in the day, there were no refrigerated units in the shipping logistics industry. So we had to go out there and pioneer a way to put these refrigerated units on trucks and trains. And then ultimately, all the markets had to be convinced to create what we now call a frozen food aisle. And it's amazing to think frozen foods is a category, and it is. It didn't exist. It was inspired in the 1920s, and it's something that we consider very normal. And Clarence changed the way the world works by trying to solve a problem called how do we get fresh vegetables out to the masses. And that's just one example of a category that kind of lives right under our noses, but maybe you don't see it because it's so obvious. And we'll talk a lot about how that happens time and time again as these categories form in the world. And so with that said, Play Bigger, we're an advisory firm. We do category design, but a few years back, we decided to do some research to really investigate the path that these category kings, these leaders like Salesforce, Amazon, Uber, etc. What was the path and structure they took to become the kings of these categories? And we literally looked at every single VC or venture-backed firm in the venture-backed company since 2000 in the United States, and spoke to about 150 CEOs and founders, and basically codified everything that we learned, plus all the work that we did as operators, into our book, Play Bigger. And that book is really the field manual for how to, literally walk through the same path that these category kings walk through, to create a category, define a category, develop it, and hopefully dominate it. And the book has really found its way out there and across the world and back. And we're happy to share some insights that we discovered while doing our research for that book, as well as some of the stuff that we've learned from our customers and the companies we get to work with. The core premise around category design always evolves around this thing we call the magic triangle, which is, category is the third leg of the stool, or we like to joke, the third leg of the bar stool. And the category strategy and design goes hand in hand with company design and product design. And when all three of these things move together, you have the recipe to become a category king. And so, as said, we want to share some of the highlights of some of the science and art behind category design, and then really drop down into some hopefully practical know-how on how to take these insights back to work with you. At the highest level, we believe the problem is the core focus of the category, and we like to joke the problem is not the problem is your attitude about the problem. And if you start with the problem, that is the proxy for the category. And some of the examples we give in the book, as well as things that we've all experienced in life, are really the genesis for how these categories are formed. And if you look at some of these, some of you may have recognized some of these problems, like I need to make a louder guitar. That was a problem that an individual named Les Paul solved by creating an electric guitar. I want to surf in cold water longer. That was a problem, at least in Northern California, we have. If you walk out into a 55-degree water, you're not going to stay in the water long. And a guy named Jack O'Neill solved that problem with a wetsuit. And then taxi stink was a problem that was solved by Uber and Lyft. And then the last one was one of my favorites that we discovered when doing the research, was a problem simply stated, just because I'm tired doesn't mean I'm thirsty. So again, the problem is just because I'm tired doesn't mean I'm thirsty. And that problem was solved by a new category called an energy shot in a particular company called 5 Hour Energy, or I'm sorry, the product is 5 Hour Energy. And again, they went after an age-old problem. How do you get that boost of energy that you need when you're tired? But they created an alternative to coffee and an alternative to soft drinks, because they basically said, I'm tired, but I'm not thirsty. And at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, you might not want a cup of stale coffee. You might not want a big can of Red Bull. So I don't know what's in this 5 Hour Energy. I drink a lot of them. If you know me, I get kind of, crazy after I have one, but they do work and they do solve that problem, which led to probably one of the highest cost per ounce new, I don't even think it's a soft drink, products, energy shot products in the market today. And if you pay attention to where it's stocked in shelves, it would be a good proxy for why it's a category, because it's not stocked next to coffee, it's not stocked next to soft drinks, it's up at the point of sale. And that's a good example of solving a problem and basically changing and creating an alternative for people in the world to, get that extra boost in the afternoon. So the second insight is category design is a winner-take-all game. And in fact, 76% of the economics for the entire market category goes to one company. 76% of the economics goes to one company. And we were kind of surprised at this. And we looked at, again, all of the companies, VC-backed companies since 2000, and data showed true that these category kings like Facebook and Apple and Google and Uber have, there's no second place competitor. I think Uber, last time I checked, was worth over 50 billion and Lyft was maybe 10. But there's a giant gap between the kings of categories and the second place, and nobody even knows who's third place. And even more distinctly in categories like social media, I don't know if there is another company that stands up to Facebook or LinkedIn in business social media. And so it's like winner take all game. And so that says, if you want to win, you want to have a chance at becoming a category king, it's pretty much a net sum game to take over the entire category and think about the strategy to do that. Also, the category kings take all the talent, and we were involved or asked to comment on some research that LinkedIn put out about the companies that people really, really want to work for. Turns out that the top 7 of those companies on the list were category kings. The develop phase of the category life cycle is where all the action happens. And if you take a look at the book, if you have a chance, we basically parse out the development and evolution of a category into three major phases. This was borrowed from some great work that Paul Borowski did on the automotive sector and how the automotive and transportation sector works. But if you look at the three major categories, there's a define phase, develop phase, and dominant phase. And if you look at the blue line, the define phase represents the number of vendors coming into the space. And if any of us in the Silicon Valley has ever been around during, like, I'll use an example, the big data phase, right? That we kind of heard it as a whisper in the wind, and all of a sudden, there's $5 billion in funding and $50 billion in funding. And we could joke that if everybody jumps into the deep end of the pool and starts clamoring for the top of the hill. I think even Gartner calls this their hype cycle. And then after time and over time, the vendors start to consolidate, but this red line is really important. That's when all of a sudden the market cap starts to build and the value of the category starts to emerge. And so you move out of VC backed funding for success and move into things called revenue and growth. And that's what's represented on that pink line. And it turns out that the category timing really matters. We did another research that kind of unveiled something we call the 610 law, which it turns out that all the companies that went public since 2000 that were venture backed, all of the market cap generated happened with companies that were between 6 and 10 years old. And if you go back to the curve, if you look at the time basis, the develop phase represents where the 6 and 10 year mark is. The time frame here is 15 years. And so what that says is there's very material implications on having defined the category and develop it for your potential outcome if you were a company that's fortunate enough to go public. And it's not an average. All the companies that were that went public in that 6 to 10 year time frame generated all of the market cap on a positive scale post IPO. The fourth insight is categories are not static, and the long-term value is immense. And so categories evolve over time. And this slide always ages me a bit, but I was around in the early 1990s before CRM has evolved as a category that we all know now as cloud CRM, and as evidenced by the giant cloud tower that Salesforce built in San Francisco. And so, but what people, if you go back in time, prior to CRM, the problem was not CRM. It didn't even exist at the time. The problem was around contact management. And there was two very hot companies that people talked about back then. One was called Act, the other one was called Goldmine. And the problem was, how do you take your Rolodex and convert it over to a digital card? And that was a very successful category that then eventually evolved over to Salesforce automation, when people realized, well, if I can digitize the card, why wouldn't I capture the information I'm having while making these phone calls? And specifically, a company called Brock Systems automated the process of sales. And then ultimately, a company called Siebel Systems came in and decided the problem was not about automating Salesforce automation, but the problem is all about consolidating all the customer data into a single place and allowing your salespeople, customer service people, field service people, IT help desk folks access the same database of information on the customer to unify the customer view. And they built a mega empire called client server CRM. And at one point in time in the early 2000s, nobody could even imagine Siebel Systems not controlling their destiny in CRM. But then again, the problem shifted. The problem evolved to the fact that client server technologies were almost impossible to implement. And they took a team of Accenture consultants in a couple of years to even get the first instance of these very complex, hard to implement software packages. And so along came Salesforce, introduced us to a world called an application service provider, said that you can consume software like you do at the time My Yahoo, or like, plug and play. You put in a quarter and out comes CRM. Changed the entire face of how the software industry worked. And they came out with a point of view around no software. Eventually that morphed to what we can now call the cloud. And these evolving categories are important because it's important to know what curve you're on. And ultimately, we joke, but it's not a joke. Picking the right category curve is ultimately an existential decision. Because if you stay on the curve too long, you might end up where Blockbuster ended up. And if you ride the right curve, you might pick up right where Blockbuster left off and be in the curve that Netflix is on. And it's kind of hard to imagine, but back in the day, Netflix was not what they are today. They had a single value proposition of no late fees, and they would ship you a DVD, and you'd watch your movie instead of driving to Blockbuster to stand in line to get that movie. And At the time, it wasn't really clear that they were on a different category curve, but very clear now. And these curves are very important for category designers to understand, where's the next curve and how do you create that curve or jump that curve to increase your chances of becoming the king of that curve. Another element to category design is brain science and how the brain works. And this is getting a little heady, pun intended, but at the end of the day, it's sort of a mind game on how these categories are formed, because ultimately companies and products live within containers in our heads, right? And these containers are called categories. And it's kind of hard to explain what is a category, but basically categories are the way we sort of navigate this world based off the problem we have. And the best example we can give is what happens when you walk into a grocery store. You might be just going in for a few supplies, but a lot of people coming in to try to, buy all the food they need for a Super Bowl party or bake a cake. And ultimately, all of the food and items in the supermarket are organized by categories. And could you imagine if you walked into a Whole Foods and all the shelves were stocked in alphabetical order by the product names? You wouldn't find a thing. And that's what categories do. If you have a problem, the category directs you to an aisle, and then in that aisle are all the products and services that fulfill the problem. And so these categories are a way that we cope, and they're triggered not necessarily by logic or decision, but by almost a primal instinct to deal with like massive amounts of input coming at us and massive amounts of stimulus. And it's hard to, know where to start in this world. But what happens is our brains take over and start to kick into these cognitive biases that start to tell you, how to make your decisions or change your behavior. And these biases are important. Category designers play with these biases to help us anchor the problem in our head the right way. And anchoring effect is a huge bias that influences all sales and marketing decisions. The first person in your brain is generally setting the agenda, and everybody else follows. Groupthink is a bias that forces people to believe their safety in numbers, and where everybody else is running, that's where you want to go. Nobody wants to be the slowest zebra. Choice supportive is a bias that says once you choose something, you will almost religiously and unconditionally follow the decision you made because you want to feel like you made the right decision. And conformity is something that's just, again, the golden handcuffs. You wouldn't change your decision about a particular technology you purchased or a platform you standardized on because that might be your career at stake. And so these biases are really powerful, and they convert worlds that look like this. And this is a big data landscape from, we've all seen these Lumascapes before, and it's a hot mess. How do you know where to go, right? All these boxes are categories. And ultimately, the biases help you prioritize all these categories into something that looks like this, which is a budget. And budgets rule, and at least in the tech space, this is where you want to be. And you want to be at the top of that budget. And so the last insight I'd share from the book is category designers work from a standard framework. I won't walk you through all these details, but there's a pattern that all the category kings have followed, starting with the founding insights. Hey, I want to deliver fresh vegetables to the masses. How do I do that? I freeze them. That was the aha moment. That was how the problem was solved. That led to the ultimately the frozen food category. The second piece is blueprinting the idea so people can participate in the future with you. And I'll give some examples in that in a moment. The category name definition is more than a 3-letter acronym spin or, picking a name for your cat or dog. It's very important. It's analogous to the problem, and the category name has power, has the ability to really direct people to guessing right about the problem you solve. The point of view is something we'll talk about in a moment. Point of view is your position in the world and why it matters and why people should care. Your point of view will attract the people you want to attract to your company. It will repel the people you don't want to attract to your company. And then all the hard work, and all of us know this if you're in the tech space, there's nothing but hard work. And mobilizing your company from tip to tail, from every single person to drive the category forward just as hard as they drive the company and product forward is critical. And then we'll talk about the notion of lightning strikes. If anybody's been in San Francisco during Dreamforce, that's a lightning strike. That is a place where it's unavoidable in enterprise B2B space. When Dreamforce is happening, that is the only agenda that matters. And if you care about enterprise B2B or the cloud, basically Salesforce controls that agenda. And so these are the building blocks that category designers follow. And then there's a pretty well-worn path and very successful sequence to get all this work done to get you in a position where you can go from your insight, A, to the lightning strike and share the world the problem you see in the unique new category that solves that problem. So with that said, I promised a few takeaways, and I am talking pretty quickly here, but I wanted to fire through some things that I thought I learned, some lessons learned that, and everybody probably learns from mistakes more than from successes. So maybe if you catch me later, I can tell you some of the mistakes I've made, but we thought these takeaways would be very good for you to maybe give you some things that you could take home right after this webinar. Again, back to square one, start with the problem, right? And here's a fun thing you could do that would be really disruptive for most meetings. And these are simple questions to ask, but they're very difficult to answer. And if you're founder of a company or CEO, you might ask yourself, can you answer these questions about your company, your category? If you're thinking about starting a company, start with these questions. Or if you're in a company and you're trying to sort out, where's the genesis of our category, these questions are very effective ways to kind of smoke out the core problem we're solving, right? And ultimately, if you ask yourself, explain to me like a 5-year-old what problem you're solving. You solve that problem perfectly. What category are you in? And if you took 75% of the economics or 76% of the economics, how big is the category? Take these away, use them, and I think I'd love to hear back from you if the answers were easy to come by or created a pretty tough set of meetings to answer. Ultimately, the biggest problem solver in at least the enterprise tech space is Salesforce, and they came out not with the greatest new version of SFA or CRM. In fact, their sales funnel looks similar to the Siebel sales funnel, and that hasn't changed. But they came out with a point of view and a problem called no software, and they basically used this problem that software is impossible to implement, and then therefore cloud was the answer to consume software in a completely different way to great effect, right? And again, you don't have to drive around San Francisco to not see the demonstration of that success with the Salesforce Tower. The second takeaway is position your category repositioned. And anybody in the tech space who spent any time working with our friends in the analyst industry understands what I'm going to say next. So you either position your category or you be positioned. And many of us, including myself, have woken up the day where the Magic Quadrant's finally published and you have this kind of look on your face, right? It's getting Mike Tyson's tattoo on your face when you didn't actually ask for it. And these category analysts are very good at moving the dots around and got tons of respect for them, but at the end of the day, you're not really controlling where you land. And you kind of have to suffer from this tattoo for as long as Google will allow you to search for it. And Forrester Waves and IDC reports, it's all part of the kind of massive tattoo parlor that we believe you don't have to participate in. It may be a part of the path for a category development, but it's not the only outcome. And we get a lot of questions, is the Magic Quadrant the end state? And we actually say, no, it's just one of the waypoints you pass on the way to building a category that you define. We don't believe that companies like Gartner, Forrester, IDC, even though they're great people, are the ones that should determine your destiny. And so you don't want to wake up with Mike Tyson's tattoo on your face. You want to have some control, then we believe category design is the antidote for that. Blueprint the future. So if you want to create a category, you have to enlist people to see what you see. You have to bring them along for the ride. One of the greatest blueprints that I really appreciate is what Lyft wrote around this manifesto on the road ahead. And they talked about, you may believe that today's category is all about ride sharing and the ride sharing economy, but they articulated a very strong case for the fact that automobiles and the infrastructure supporting automobiles may be the biggest waste of infrastructure on the planet Earth. And they proposed a new world around transportation as a service. And if you read this, you realize we're just the beginning of that new category forming and the way the world's going to, get from point A to point Z. And by sharing this vision and this road ahead and this blueprint, it kind of gets you excited to, participate in something, and it changes the context for what the future may look like. The master of sharing their vision and bringing us along for the ride, I believe, is Elon Musk. And I don't know if anybody's had a chance to just Google this, the SpaceX plans to get us to Mars and back. If you read it, it almost sounds like it's already happened. And now all of a sudden, we're rooting for every one of those rockets to land safely on the barges, and we're rooting for the car in space. And if you didn't have context for what they were doing at SpaceX, it might seem kind of weird that they were trying to, take off and land rockets or sending Teslas into space. It would have no context. The blueprint is the context for the journey, and people will root for you. Get on board the journey, and if you want them to join the category, you have to show them the path, and that's what the blueprint does. Number 4 here for a takeaway is your point of view is not a message. And a point of view is really critical. Point of views are arguably one of the most important components of the categories designers use to help move those cognitive biases around, to anchor problems in your head that you didn't even know you had sometimes, and present a different way to solve that problem. And ultimately, a point of view is an argument that you create that you can win. And one of the examples we like to give a lot is, point of views aren't always that obvious. They're not written up on the wall, but most people can answer this question, right? The pop quiz here is, which company has a point of view? Which company is controlling the expectations of the category that they're in? And I think most people would know what the answer is, right? Broken guitars, or even in the most dire of circumstances, there's a little bit of humor coming from the cockpit or the flight attendants or the staff at Southwest. And you don't have to know it, you feel it. And a point of view, if the category definition is the head, then the point of view is the heart. And a point of view is a framework that any of you can take away. You can take this screenshot right here, right now, and apply this to any of the work that you're doing on communications and messaging, and start to move the conversation from answer first to problem first. And it's nothing that Play Bigger invented. It's something that's been used in debate classes and politics and my favorite late night infomercials. In the whole world, if you want to communicate what problem you have, the vision, the ramifications for that problem, the vision for the future, and what to do, you, by filling out this framework and following, and a lot of the guidelines are in the book, you can get from 0 to a full story in 30 seconds or less, or 3 minutes or less. And it's a really powerful framework to help people understand what your point of view about the problem is, and therefore it creates context for what your answer is. Language matters. I could go long on this, but I'm going to talk real fast. At the end of the day, there's a big difference between a sea panda and a killer whale. And ultimately, category designers use language to change behaviors. There was a point in time that coffee was free, or something you got for $0.25 in a gas station, or something that you got spilled in your lap at McDonald's. But now it's completely different. When Starbucks came out, they didn't introduce new coffee, a better coffee. They introduced a different way to consume coffee through language: cafe, lattes, mocha, frappuccino, cappuccino. They borrowed the language set of coffee drinkers around the world and put it into a container called the Starbucks experience, and then ultimately used that to make you feel okay paying $5 for something you used to pay 25 cents for. And this is powerful because language, and if you're in the tech industry, and I'm going to pick on us all, we butcher language in the tech industry. We kind of treat it really badly, and we use it in horrible forms, shapes and forms. And one of the best examples of this is the about section of any company in enterprise, or in the tech space. And for some reason, we believe that this type of description of a company, right down to the high fructose, GMO-free, cage-free wireless computing system, makes sense to people. And it doesn't. And the more clarity you have in your language, the more chances people are going to feel the way you want them to feel. And I grew up in Iowa, and I used to have a gut check with my dad in Iowa, where I would read him point of views and share with him what I was working on. And if it made sense, then he gave me a big pat on the back. And if it didn't, he told me maybe it's time to get out of California and move back home to the farm. And the lesson I learned there is, if you're going to write something, write it the way you would say it. Or after you write it, read it. And if that's not how you talk, rewrite it. And the more you speak like a human, the more humans can understand what you mean. And please, if we could make one big change in the world, let's not write any more of those boilerplates, because those things are painful to read and even and more impossible to understand. Rounding home base here, takeaway 6, be different, not better. Again, we'll go back to that Starbucks and 5-hour energy example. Starbucks didn't create a better coffee, even though some people think that's what happened. They created a different way to consume coffee, a different way inspired by the way the rest of the world consumed coffee as an experience, not something that you just did. And they created the third place, a place to go to on the way to work and a place to go to on the way home. And they used language and all the category design techniques to create this new category of ultimately now you see it artisan coffee shops everywhere, right? And they cost an extraordinarily large amount of money. Same with 5 Hour Energy. They didn't go in and say we're a better, energy kick. We're better than coffee. We're better than soft drinks. We're better than Red Bull. They said we're just different, and you don't have to be thirsty to consume this and change the rest of the energy for the rest of the day. Number 7, know your Frotos. Frodo is not a hobbit going to Mount Doom, and people tease us about this term all the time. But a Frodo is a short slang for a from to. And all categories designers understand that you have to start somewhere. And the place you start is what everybody currently thinks about the problem, your company, or your products. So that's always the starting point. And category designers, when you start with a problem, there's always 2 classes of problems. Problems that people know they have, but didn't think there was an alternative. So you had a problem in San Francisco not being able to hail a cab, but you didn't know there was an alternative to hitch a ride with somebody. Or a problem you didn't know you have, but you had no idea that there was a different world. And I believe Airbnb fell into that category, where I don't think there was a giant crisis with the hotel industry, but they created a problem saying, hey, instead of going to rent a hotel and living in a one-size-fits-all experience when you're visiting Paris, why don't you go to Paris and experience Paris and live in somebody's home in Paris? And they created a new option in our lives, and they solved the problem you didn't even know you have. And ultimately, all these problems start with the current state, and then these category designers have to work really hard to show you that the future is safe, sound, and a reasonably smart way to move forward. And one of the examples we give a lot is Lyft. And I swear, if you would go back to maybe even 10 years ago, if somebody pulled up in a used Prius with a pink mustache in their car, most of our training from our childhood would say, run away, call the police, and do not, stranger danger, do not jump in that car, and do not, talk to strangers. And literally, if you think about it really hard, today's ride sharing, outside of maybe the more professional sedans in the Uber fleet, is built around hopping in a car with somebody you don't know, trusting they know how to get from point A to point Z, trusting that they're actually a good driver. And some people throw their whole families in these ride shares and trust it implicitly that this is an absolute safe and sound option. But that didn't start. That's where the world ended, or where we are today. That's the 2. But we started with a from that said, hey, I have to convince you that it's okay to hop in a car, let alone a stranger's car, and to give you a safe alternative to taxis. So the from tos are really important. And the last thing I'll say before we get to questions is gravity is probably the biggest enemy of category design. Gravity is your day job. Gravity is, you're here to find gravity right here, right now on this webinar. 5 minutes after you get off of this webinar, you probably go grab a coffee because it's still morning time in California. 5 Hour Energy in the afternoon. No sponsorship tied to them. Just joking. But gravity is going to hit you. You're going to have a day full of meetings, and it's going to take your mind off of thinking big and differently about what category you're going to be in. And we always joke, our day jobs, and I spent 20 years as an operator running up and down the agency world in the Midwest and tech companies in the Silicon Valley. And, every day felt like this, right? And up and down the habit trail and running around. And for some reason, you woke up at 6 a.m. and then you blink and it's 9 o'clock at night. And you still have 2 hours of emails to go and you don't have time to think. And so this gravity is something that you have to create space to think big and think differently and open up a different conversation about what category you're in. And arguably, if you can't find that space and time, it's going to be tough to have this conversation. So with that said, I believe that's it. Yeah, that's the last part, kind of key insight that I wanted to share. And if there are any questions out there, I'd love to answer them. And again, I really appreciate your time today.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dave. That was great. So we do have one question from Gerardo, and he asks, is it viable to try to dominate an existing category if it is accepted and there is no clear leader? Or is it better to try to create a new one?
Great question. Great question. So if there is, and I hope there's a couple ways to come at this. If there is an incumbent or a current category king that basically defined the category, set the rule book for that category, and is dominating that category, we believe it's pretty much impossible to unseat the king. And the best example I could give was the big campaign that Microsoft Bing ran to try to unseat Google. And they spent $10 billion to try to move people's search advertising from Google to Microsoft, and didn't put a dent into Google's revenue, and probably put a dent into Microsoft's reputation in that space. And it's just virtually impossible to take, hop on that donkey, grab your, literally head up windmill and try to knock off the incumbent. However, for every space that's created and dominated by a king, basically, today's solutions create tomorrow's problems. And they generally will create a problem by solving one problem. You create another problem. And I would always recommend, and we would always recommend, look for the problem that stands right behind the answer. And there is the fresh green field, blue ocean, a lot of different terms for that new space. Get in there and define the problem first, category second, and then your answer third. And then if you're on that blue line, if you remember that big curve where everybody's jumping into the pool, it's okay. A lot of those, jump right in. But think about it through the category lens, and that you're probably already going to be operating from a different playbook than 99% of the rest of the people in the pool, who are leading with product first, features first, capabilities first, solution first. And if you can frame the problem better, people will accept that your answer is different, or at least more relevant, because you're going to hit the head and the heart.
That's great. If anyone else has a question, feel free to keep adding. So next question, what's the CEO's involvement with the category design process?
Excellent. The CEO is the, key founder, CEO is the linchpin for success. It has to come from her, otherwise it won't move forward. And there have been a few exceptions where we've seen categories driven from the CMO seat, or the VP of product marketing seat, or even COO seats. But at the end of the day, you're doing category design when all functions of the business change. The products are changing, the engineering priorities will change, the sales enablement and focus on how you train sales will change. And the only way to create all that change, the only person in the exec team that can make that change happen, happens to be the CEO. And so that's where it kind of starts and ends. And we have plenty of war stories of trying to roll that rock up the hill from the CMO seat. And things can be done. A CMO can create a point of view. CMO can even do a blueprint. But it's hard to really create the institutional change in a company to embrace category as the third leg of the stool, or the third piece of the triangle. And so start and end with the CEO. And we do definitely have some ideas on how to get that conversation started without, forcing a career limiting move. So be happy to share those insights anytime after the webinar.
That's great. And another question. So how long should we expect the process to take before we get a lightning strike?
Great. So if you remember, there's a slide that sort of showed the tip the tail process. That is, if you walk into the room and slam the book on the table and say, we want to do category design, and then the first lightning strike out the door is about 5 to 6 months. That's hard work. Those are hard deadlines. But we believe the process actually forces the decision, and the decision is literally the output. You can have great point of views and really cool looking blueprints, and even aggressive lightning strikes that dazzle the eye. But at the end of the day, it's the decision to add the category definition, problem, blueprint, point of view into the mix that's really the outcome. And it takes a long time to change your mind about your own business, the problem you solve, and the category that you're in. And that, but we've seen time and time again, companies go from zero to lightning strike in less than 6 months. And then the more important picture is the first strike. Categories take 6 to 10 years to develop. And so you should be executing lightning strikes every 6 months for years and years and years. And Dreamforce is a yearly event, not a one-time event. And you have to keep conditioning the market over and over and over again to get the category to really go from define to develop to dominate. And the first 6 months is the beginning of the journey. And then once you're on the path, I believe it actually gets easier after that point.
Wonderful. Does anybody else have a question? If not, as I mentioned before, I'm going to be sharing the recording as well as the presentation slides on our blog and be sending you an email later today. So thanks again, Dave. That was amazing. And bigger thanks to everyone who's joined here today. Hope to see you in the next webinar.
Thank you.